In today's episode of Today in World War II, we're going to be talking about November 19th. And this day, the British prepare a resistant agents to drop into France. The Soviets find a new way to supply their besieged city of Leningrad. Britain sends a disastrous commando raid to Norway. The Soviets start a left and right hook combined to encircle the Germans in Stalingrad. The U.S. sub Harder has a great day in the South Pacific, and General Patton finally takes a town in France that he's been trying to take for 2 years. Let's get started. So, this is one of the most tragic individual stories that I ever read about World War II. There's this woman, she's an Indian woman. She was actually born in Russia. Parents moved to Britain and then they moved to France. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan. She was a devout pacifist, but she was so horrified by the Nazi tyranny that she decided that she needed to do something to help. So she volunteered to work with the British, and on this day, she joined the British Women's Auxiliary Air Force. That was just a cover to give, resistance workers cover to supposedly there was, they're in the military and would be covered by the Geneva Convention. Well, that didn't work. The Germans didn't care about that, but she was eventually trained by the Special Operations Executive (SOE), and her code name was Madeline. She was trained as a wireless operator, and she was dropped into Paris. And she was the communications hub for the resistance unit Prosper. Well, it didn't end well for her. Tragically, she was sold out by a couple of French people for 100,000 francs. She was arrested. But what I find interesting is that she was able to use her agent training, and she attempted to escape from a hospital and killed one of her guards, but she was captured and then tortured horribly, and then eventually she was executed in Dachau concentration camp. I just have no words for the bravery of these women that don't get enough credit in history about their contribution, especially the ones that went behind the lines. So today, on November 19th, 1941, Soviet General Lagunov drove a truck across the Lake Ladoga ice, which borders Leningrad, and he decided that it was safe enough to be able to start supplying the besieged city with supplies, food, and ammunition, and so on and so forth. The siege of Leningrad was horrible. It was just horrible. It's like 900 and something days where they were cut off. It wasn't like they did get some supplies, but it wasn't enough. And like for example, in the winter was the best way to get them across because they could just drive across the ice. But you can imagine how the Germans were concentrating on that, and the it was just barbaric. The Eastern Front was just absolute barbarism because there was no quarter on any side, and those there was approximately 600, maybe 630 Soviet civilians that died of starvation during the siege of Leningrad. And I have nothing but awe for them. My father-in-law was a Soviet infantryman who fought all 4 years in the Soviet army, wounded grievously, survived, and I've had a chance to talk to a lot of Soviet veterans who were in the war, and some of those who were involved in the siege of Leningrad. And it's just absolutely tragic to read the stories. I mean, they would start trying to take off siding, in their apartments and eat the glue, and it was just awful. So on that day, at least they were able to start moving some supplies in, and of course at this time, they only the attack had started in June, and so by November they were already hurting. So on this day, November 19th, 1942, the British sent a commando raid against the Vemork heavy water plant in Telemark, Norway, which is near Oslo. I talked about this a few days ago. The British were trying very very much to stop the heavy water production because it had to do with the German attempts to get the atomic bomb. Now, the Germans never got close to developing a bomb, but the Brits didn't know that. So, of course, if you were thinking about why they would want to keep the Germans from having the atomic bomb. London being probably the target of the atomic bomb, you can see why they were so desperately trying to uh, stop that heavy water production. In this case, they sent a commando raid. There was 34 commandos and gliders, and unfortunately, the gliders crashed. Some of the commandos died, but some of them survived. The Nazis tortured them, and they were shot summarily. Hitler had given a command that the commandos were not to be taken prisoner. They were to be, you know, interrogated and then shot. So if you think about that, all these commandos knew about this, and they still volunteered. They still went to fight, knowing that if they got captured, it was over. The bravery was just incredible. And the British, their special forces, their commandos were elite. And, unfortunately, lots of losses, and this is what happened. In this particular case, they had a crash and they all died. All 100% casualties. On this day, on November 19th, 1942, the Soviet Union launched a surprise counterattack against the the German garrison, not garrison, but the German army, the Sixth Army, that was in Stalingrad. What they were doing was they did a flanking maneuver. So they had um, they had a pincer force on the north of Stalingrad, and they had a pincer force in the south of Stalingrad. And so what they were doing was they were going to break through the lesser defended areas on the outskirts of Stalingrad and go around, and the pincers would move together and surround Stalingrad. And it's interesting because the Germans were desperate for soldiers. They had some heavy losses the previous year when they tried to attack Moscow and couldn't take it. And so they had Italians, they had Spanish, they had Spaniards, they had Romanians, they had different troops, different nationalities that were defending these areas. Now, they were not as good as the Germans were. So the Soviets knew that they did their intelligence, and so they attacked them at the weakest point. And from everything I've read, there were very, very few survivors of those attacks. They just got annihilated. And so eventually what happened is that the Soviets were able to encircle Stalingrad, put the vice on them, and eventually the Field Marshal von Paulus surrendered, and the Germans lost 250,000 soldiers in that battle. It was devastating for them. About 130 were taken prisoner. Think about this, only 5 or 6,000 survived captivity from 110,000. Shows you what it was like to be a captive, a German captive in the Soviet Union. On today's date, November 19th, 1943, the United States submarine Harder was on patrol in the South Pacific, and it detected a convoy of 3 Japanese transports. Harder was operating in a wolf pack, but it was the first one to see the ship, so it radioed the message to there are 2 subs operating in the same area, and then Harder attacked. Harder sank 2 transports, the Udomaru and the Hokomaru, and they did damage a third one, and it sunk the next day. The Harder was one of the best subs in the Pacific War for the U.S. Their captain, Sam Dealey, I don't want to call him a maniac, but he was one of the most aggressive captains that the submarine service in the U.S. had during the war. He was later, I mean, unfortunately, on the sixth patrol under Dealey, the sub was sunk, and he would get a Medal of Honor for that. But I tell you, you should read about the Harder, Wikipedia, there's books out there I've read. They're amazing, and what they did and how aggressive they were. So, kudos to the Harder. Finally, on November 19th, 1944, the United States 95th Division fought its way into Metz, France. Metz was a very tough nut to crack. Patton, who was his army was in charge of the southern flank of the Allied offensive when they broke out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and they pushed on a wide front to Germany. They excuse me. Metz had a series of forts that had been built in the previous century. There had been a lot of, these forts had been used by the French in World War I against the Germans, and now the Germans had occupied them and they were using them against the Americans. Uh, it took about 3.5 months of nonstop fighting for Patton to take Metz. And on this day, his troops entered Metz finally. Now, it didn't end the battle. I mean, they took the city, but there was still a few forts that had to be taken. They weren't liquidated until December 13th, which ironically was about the time when the Battle of the Bulge started, when the Germans invaded the Ardennes in 1944 in December. And think about this, it's crazy. Here Patton is, he is in the middle of a major battle, and then when the Germans invade the Ardennes, he was able to pivot in 2 or 3 days and start attacking north to save the U.S. paratroopers in Bastogne. So he was quite the general, I tell you. Well, I want to thank you for watching this video. I love doing these videos for you every day. I hope that you spread the word. Let me know. And I would like to get more people to see my content. So, and also don't forget to like and comment on my video.